And if I told you that there are manuscripts as old as the texts of your Bible, but what were hidden for centuries, stored in caves, buried in jars, sealed not only by dust, but by fear? In 1947, a group of Bedouins made a discovery that would forever change the history of faith. In caves near the Dead Sea, they found ancient scrolls, some older than the Gospels themselves. Mysterious, deep texts, and dangerous. Why? Because they revealed a different spirituality, a forgotten lineage, rituals that resemble baptism, prophecies that speak of two Messiah, not one, and mystical views that challenge everything the official tradition wanted to preserve. But the strangest, it was not the content, it was the silence. Have you ever wondered why, decades after this discovery, most of these texts never came to the public? Why were they locked, studied in secret, and released only to the dropper? What was in them? That should not be read. Or worse, what they revealed. Who has shaped the faith you know? In this episode, we will investigate the manuscripts of the Dead Sea like you have never seen. Let's follow the tracks of prohibited texts. Let's find out who hid them, who tried to erase them, and what they still have to tell us. But be warned, after knowing what is behind these scrolls, you may never read the Bible the same way. It all started with a chance, or at least that's what official history tells us. At the end of 1946, a young Bedouin named Muhammad Ed Stip, looking for a stray goat near Qumran, stumbled into an opening in the rock. Upon entering, he found ancient sealed clay jars. Inside them, not gold, but something infinitely more valuable. Leather and papyrus scrolls, intact after more than 2,000 years. What he and the world did not yet know is that those manuscripts would change the way we understand faith, the story, and even Jesus himself. The place where they were found, the caves of Qumran, on the banks of the Dead Sea, was not anywhere. There was an enigmatic community, known as the Essenes, a group radically committed to spiritual purity, removed from the Temple of Jerusalem, who believed to live the last days before a great divine revelation. The text found revealed that the Essenes had their own version of the scriptures, with detailed comments about the book of Isaiah, the Psalms, and even Deuteronomy. But they also had unknown writings so far, mystical hymns, cosmic calendars, secret rules of the community, apocalyptic views, and prophecy that spoke of two anointed, a king and a priest, who would come together to restore the covenant. These documents, contrary to popular belief, were not soon shared with the world. For decades, most of them have been controlled by a small group of European and ecclesiastical scholars who restricted access to independent researchers. While some fragments were released, most of them remained hidden in coffers, university basements, and private files from the Vatican. The argument? They need to be translated correctly. The suspicion? There are things there that is not appropriate to be said. But why so much confidentiality? Why so much control over texts that, in theory, would only be another archaeological find? Perhaps the answer is in the content. Because what the Dead Sea manuscripts suggest is that the traditional narrative of faith was carefully edited. And it is precisely when we observed who had access and who was excluded that we begin to understand the real impact of these texts. But for that, we now need to look at the characters, the backstage, and the decisions that have transformed this discovery into a minefield of silence and censorship. The discovery was made in 1947, but did you know that most texts were only publicized to the public decades later? Shortly after the manuscripts reached the hands of the Jordanian authorities, an international scholars committee was formed to study them. But this committee, called International Team, had a revealing detail. It was composed almost exclusively by European Catholic academics, many of them directly or indirectly linked to the Vatican. For years, this group has kept the manuscripts under absolute control. Jewish, Protestant, or independent researchers were rejected. The fragments were stored under strict secrecy, and any attempt to disclose was barred. Meanwhile, the few parts released were carefully selected, texts that did not threaten doctrines, or that just seemed to confirm what was already known. But the most sensitive documents, those who spoke of two Messiah, of a spiritual war between children of light and children of darkness, or from a master of justice persecuted by corrupt religious leaders, these remained silent, some for over 40 years. Why? Because disturbing connections began to emerge. Some scholars, when reading certain Essene hymns, saw echoes from the Sermon on the Mount. Others found parallels between the Master of Justice of the Essenes and the figure of Jesus. Not a copy, but a possible ordinary route, or at least one previous movement that prepared the way for something larger. If confirmed, this would directly challenge the narrative of the absolute originality of Christianity and would cast doubts about the control that Jerusalem and Rome exerted on the memory of their own foundations. In 1991, after intense pressure from the academic community, an unauthorized copy of parts of the manuscripts was published. The confidentiality was broken, but the question remained: why do these texts, found in 1947, only arrived in the public almost half a century later? What was there that so much fear caused? And even more important, who benefited from silence? The answer may be not only in content, but in the symbols, practices, and spiritual parallels that these texts bring. And that is precisely what we will explore now. Among the more than 900 manuscripts found in Qumran, few are known to the public. Most have never been read in sermons, nor taught in religious schools, and maybe for good reasons. Because what these texts contain is not just history, it is provocation. A silent provocation, camouflaged in symbols, rituals, and doctrines that challenge religious structure as we know it today. The Essenes, authors of many of these writings, lived according to a radically distinct spirituality from the Jerusalem officer. They rejected the temple, the corrupted priests, and created a community of purification, silence, and spiritual vigilance. Your practices? Prolonged fasts, daily ritual baths, not occasional, deep meditation, and the most curious, the refusal to sacrifice animals, preferring direct mystical communion with God. Among the most impressive documents is the Community Rule, which describes in detail a society based on total sharing, absolute moral purity, an ending for the end times, not as a chaotic event but as an internal revelation. Another remarkable text is the Master's Hymn, a poetic collection with visions of spiritual glory, inner darkness, and an invisible struggle between the soul and the powers of the world. There are excerpts there that resemble the Psalms, but with an almost Gnostic tone. And then, the most disturbing, the concept of two Messiah. Yes, the Essenes were waiting for two anointed, a priest to restore wisdom, and a king to restore justice. This idea breaks the narrative of a single expected savior and raises a delicate question. Was Jesus, for some of the early Christians, the union of these two roles? Or was part of what he taught was already practiced in silence in the caves of Qumran? Moreover, many of the manuscripts speak of a master of righteousness, persecuted, rejected by the priests, and whose voice echoed against the corruption of religious power. Coincidence? Or are we facing a lost link between the prophetic tradition and the emergence of Christianity? These symbols, these practices, these names, they were not ignored by chance. They were removed because they expose another way, another lineage, another memory of faith, one that does not depend on temples, dogmas, or institutions. And when this memory begins to be rescued, it transforms not only what you believe, but why do you believe it? If the truth release, why did so many strive to hide it so much? Shortly after the discovery of the Dead Sea manuscripts, a silent but devastating process began. Integer documents disappeared from the first reports. Excerpts considered sensitive were set aside. Some simply were not translated. Editorial control was not technical. It was strategic. Fragments that spoke of a crucified master of justice, symbolically by traitory priests, silenced. Text that suggested a spiritual structure not based on blood sacrifices, but in inner purification, muffled. Passages that questioned the legitimacy of the Jerusalem priesthood, labeled sectaries. And the most symbolic, manuscripts, like the Roll of War, which speak of the battle between the children of light and the children of darkness, were interpreted as political metaphors, never spiritual. But what if they are talking about something much deeper, of a clash between two types of faith, a living, silent inner, and another, institutionalized with dogmas, walls, and censorship? For years, access to the originals was restricted to a few experts, all chosen by a religious influence committee. The others? They had to settle for fragments, controlled interpretations, and official translations. But why so much effort to hide? Because the manuscripts reveal that spiritual tradition was much richer, diverse, and alive than the canonized version. And this puts something fundamental in check. The idea that religion as we know today was passed intact, pure, perfect. If part of the story was censored, if certain books have been excluded, if teachings have been reinterpreted, what else was removed from the spiritual map of humanity? Perhaps the biggest fear was not the content of these texts, but what they would do to those who read them. Because by reading them, you realize that faith was not born ready. It was built, piece by piece, word by word, and sometimes, brick by brick of silence. What happens to a faith when part of their origin were hidden? What happens to a soul? When do you deny you the roots of your own call? For decades, perhaps centuries, we have been taught that faith came in the form of a closed book, with beginning, middle, and end. But the manuscripts of the Dead Sea remind us of something forgotten. Faith was born in silence, in fragments, in deserts. And if part of this faith has been erased, it did not disappear. It was between the lines. It was empty. It was in that strange feeling that many feel when attending a church and yet come out with an incomplete soul. Modern spirituality suffers from a kind of sacred anemia, not for lack of content, but for excess of doctrine and absence of mystery. And the mystery, this is what the manuscripts carry. They do not bring easy answers, but they evoke questions that burn. Who was the true master of justice? Why did the Essenes retire from the temple? What does it really mean to be a son of light? More than that, they show that there were other ways of living the faith, to purify yourself, to connect with the divine, without the need for mediators, structures, or power systems. By denying these texts to the public for so long, they denied something deeper: the freedom to seek, to compare, to doubt, to build a spirituality that was not inherited, but awakened. And perhaps that's why so many today are moving away from traditional religions, not because they lost their faith, but because they feel that part of the truth was silenced. And they are right. But silence does not last forever. The manuscripts of the Dead Sea emerged from the desert as voices buried for centuries. And now that they were found, they not only challenge the official narrative, they light something that, within many, was already waiting to wake up. And if what the story tried to bury is that exactly what God wanted to preserve, and if the Dead Sea manuscripts were not discovered by chance, but in the right time, when humanity was ready to hear what could not bear before, what to do with texts that reveal mystical practices, apocalyptic views, and a forgotten Messiah? Ignore? Discredit? Or listen with the heart? The big question is not why they were hidden. The big question is, what is still being hidden? And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is this: it was not just the story that silenced these texts. We were too. Each time we prefer comfort to search. Each time we choose to repeat, instead of investigating. Each time we accept the easiest version, for fear of the truest. But the desert is calling. and your caves still whisper. Because sometimes faith does not need temples or dogmas. She needs courage. In the next few episodes, we will explore the Gospels that were banned, the books that the Bible itself quotes, but it doesn't include, and the symbols that carry truths that the institutional religion never wanted to translate. Already subscribe to the channel so as not to lose an episode, because maybe what is missing in your faith, no more obedience, but more true. And the truth is a habit of surviving. Same, hidden in caves.